With great honor, I would like to present a man, welcome him here, and to thank him. I give you Dr. Thomas Szasz.
Good? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay for everybody? Thank you. A little what? Louder. Okay, a little louder. I don't have a booming voice. Well, Jeff, I'm speechless. Not really. I'm going to speak. But I can say this. I suspect that your introduction may have been better than my presentation is going to be. I mean, there is no adjective that comes to my mind. They're gracious, had touches in it which I never expected, like this being only 3 days after I arrived, and what I feel was a kind of a second birth. I was reborn, not like Jimmy Carter, but more seriously, in a new language. I was very much in love would be too strong, but I was very interested in language, and Hungarian, those of you who know anything about it, may know that it's not a European language. I thought it was a very beautiful language. Of course, I didn't know English. In any case, that was a big rupture for me. I mean, besides leaving home and everything else, I was just 18 years old. But Jeff's reference to my having come here 73 years ago is really a special touch, because I always sort of celebrate, in my mind at least, or in conversation with my brother, who is still alive at age 94, our arrival here on that day. Well, I thank you for inviting me. I thank you for your preliminary applause. And let me say, I hope and I trust that you will like me just as much when I finish as when I start. Because I prepared a special presentation for this occasion. Also, Jeff's reference to my disinvitation was a fine touch. I would have never mentioned such a thing. I never did mention such a thing. And there is no question that there is no question of forgiveness, as many wise people have observed. Unforgiving only hurts the person who is not forgiven. So that's a luxury I can't afford to have. Well, I have prepared this presentation with an eye towards not talking too long. Remember, I'm starting almost half an hour late. I'm kind of a maniacally punctual. So I will talk for probably half an hour, hopefully not more. Thank you very much. Okay. And I will begin with a powerful quotation whose author I won't identify. I will identify him at the end because I will return to it. So remember it. It's a beautiful quotation. The American people have always been anxious to know what they shall do with us. I have but one answer. I have had but one answer from the beginning. Do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played the mischief with us. All I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs. Let him alone. What I ask for the Negro is not benevolence, not pity, not sympathy, but simply justice. Now, I don't know how many of you recognize this or know this part of American history, but I will tell you later. Well, let me begin. With the 18th century, Americans considered the right to liberty, called unalienable in the Declaration of Independence, one of their most important moral values and legal protections from despotism. Today, Americans consider the psychiatrist's right to protect them from being dangerous to themselves or others, called civil commitment, one of their most important medical values and legal protections from their own hard-earned liberties. Preventive incarceration of law-abiding individuals in insane asylum, ostensibly a form of medical practice, continues to constitute the backbone of psychiatry. Abolishing psychiatric coercion and the threat of such coercion would spell the end of psychiatry and psychology, clinical psychology, and so on, as we have known it in the past and as we know it today. The founder of modern neuropsychiatry died in 1905, a German Pole, correctly noted, and I quote, "The medical treatment of mental patients began with the infringement of their personal freedom," end of quote. That was in 1890s, end of the 19th century. Wernicke reasoned that given the high premium placed upon personal freedom in the West, psychiatrists shoulder an especially heavy responsibility to the modern political order. Quotes, by virtue, I'm quoting Wernicke, by virtue of his carceral authority, the psychiatrist became the true guarantor of individual rights and the rule of law, end of quote. The first task, in my opinion, of the psychiatric critic worth his salt is to try to reverse this state of affairs. He must reject psychiatry as a branch of medicine. He must oppose the use of psychiatric force and fraud. He must repudiate the psychiatrist as a legitimate or respectable moral legislator. And he must avoid psychiatric language and must condemn it in its journalistic and professional use. Most psychiatric critics, past and present, fail miserably to pass this elementary test. By the 18th century, the Western zeitgeist had fully embraced the view that madness is a malady properly treated by incarceration of the mad person in a madhouse managed by a mad doctor. It sounds ridiculous if I put it this way. Of course, this is a forbidden language. The belief that the individual identified as mentally ill and dangerous to himself or others is justly deprived of liberty is now accepted as not merely lawful but scientific. This dissent is dismissed as unscientific and irrational. Mental health codes form an integral part of the legal systems of all modern nations and of the United Nations itself. Now don't forget that. We are all advocating illegal activities. These social developments have had far-reaching consequences, among them the popular and political acceptance of a medicalized psychiatrist language, in particular the belief that psychiatrically diagnosed, I call them incriminated individuals, suffer from objectively identifiable mental diseases which deprive him or them of responsibility and set them aside from other ostensibly mentally healthy persons. And we think, just like we talk about mad, just like we talked about witches, we talk about the mad people, mad in America. Because the management of mental illness is synonymous with the legally legitimated coercion of the mental patient by the psychiatrist objections against the practice arose even before psychiatry was called psychiatry. This is not a new idea. But it was not against psychiatry, it was against deprivation of liberty, of course, what else? Ironically, the history of psychiatry is thus synonymous not only with the medical justification of psychiatric coercion, but also with the criticism of such coercion, well over 200 years. In 1818, in his trend-setting textbook called Textbook of Disturbances of Mental Life, or Disturbances of the Soul and Their Treatment, Johann Christian Heinroth, also a German physician, died in 1843, explained as follows. Now listen carefully to these words. This is now 200 years ago. The complete concept of mental disturbances includes permanent loss of freedom, which manifests itself as a diseased condition and which comprises the domains of temperament, diseases of the spirit, and diseases of the will. All these diseases, however much as their external manifestations may differ, have one feature in common, namely that not only is there no freedom, but not even the capacity to regain freedom. Thus, individuals in this condition exist no longer in the human domain, which is a domain of freedom, but follows the coercion of internal and external natural necessity. Rather than resembling animals which are led by wholesome instinct, they resemble machines. 200 years ago, this was the psychiatrist speaking. Talks about freedom, and then comes diseases. This idea is just as popular today, actually probably more so than it had been 200 years ago. Michael Moore, a professor of law and philosophy at the University of San Diego, asserts, and I quote, mental patients resemble infants, wild beasts, plants, and stones, none of which are responsible because of the absence of any assumption of rationality. This is the law of the land. And it's certainly the law of psychiatry. Try to deviate from it. Eventually, people began to recognize that the mad doctor's power to deprive innocent persons of liberty poses a threat to everyone's freedom. In late 19th century Germany, the fear of so-called, you don't hear this word anymore, you did 50 years ago, the fear of so-called false commitment, sane persons being incorrectly diagnosed and disposed of as insane, generated a growing revolt against the practice of involuntary mental hospitalization. Now remember, the famous Rosenhan experiment was all about this. It was all nonsense from beginning to end. First of all, the psychiatrist went in and lied to the psychiatrist, the researcher, so-called, and lied. Well, since when can science or research begin with lying? So keep that in mind when you think about ethics too. The psychiatric profession quickly nipped this opposition in the bud, dismissing it, and I don't know how many of you know this unless you have read my books on this, dismissing this movement for freedom and law as anti-psychiatry, the German word for anti-psychiatry. It was not invented by Lang and Cooper. That was in 1908. 1908, anti-psychiatry is the word. More than half a century later, a small group of British would-be psychiatric emperors who wanted to take over, they didn't want to abolish any of this, eagerly adopted this term as a linguistic emblem of their pseudo-liberatory movement. An evil enterprise, anti-psychiatry, with which I am now routinely identified because it's, again, a word that easily rolls off the tongue. It's like anti-American or anti-freedom or anti-war or any of these things that can be used in this way. Viewing the person controlled by his passions rather than his reason as unfree is a classic Greco-Roman idea. It's not a modern scientific idea. Heinroth used this attribution to define madness. This was his definition. The man who is fettered by his passions deceives himself about the external objects and about himself. This illusion and the consequent error is called madness. In madness, the spirit is fettered and man is unfree and unhappy. Well, there you have it. You are depressed. Bipolar. See, these terms have special resonance. The early alienists thus cleverly conflated psychiatrically imputed loss of internal liberty with legally imposed deprivation of political liberty. Just as I was coming in, somebody asked me, well, isn't somebody who is starving or cold or has to sleep under bridges, isn't he deprived of liberty? Of course not. Only the state can deprive you of liberty legally. Remember that. Only the state. And its agent, lawyers, judges, psychiatrists, doctors, policemen, they have the legal power to injure you. Whatever, punishment, treatment. Well, I am elaborating on this. A stroke, for example, deprives the subject of freedom. But such a person is not, properly speaking, deprived of political liberty, nor is he incarcerated by a physician. Just as mental illness is a metaphorical illness, so unfreedom attributed to the mental patient is a metaphorical loss of freedom. He's perfectly free to do what he's doing, which is obvious if you talk to anybody who's quotes mentally ill. In that sense, mental illness is self-manufactured. Otherwise, how else could it be cured by psychotherapy? That's the greatest tribute to this fact, that in some ways a patient makes himself ill. 19th century psychiatrists knew all that. Heinroth's assertion that the insane lack freedom, that individuals in this condition exist no longer in the human domain, is a strategic claim, not a description or observation, which is where we are stuck now with so-called scientific psychiatry. Because a patient is unfree, the psychiatrist is justified in coercing him. Medical control just becomes treatment, psychic oppression becomes liberation. I wrote a whole book about that. For patients who might hope to recover, Heinroth had some hope. This is what he recommended. What is needed in such cases is constraint, in other words, more constraint, which is no way cruelty or inhumanity, but necessary for the re-education of such patients to the norm of reason. For as long as such and similar patients have their will, nothing can be done with them. The mental disturbances all have in common a starting point, a main principle to which they are subordinated, selfishness. End of quotes. In contrast, and I quote again, in contrast, I'm quoting now, the doctor of the soul, or psyche, of course there was no such thing those days as psychiatry, or mental illness. In mental illness, the Germans still don't have a word for mental illness, like English has. In contrast, the doctor of the soul has overcome selfish interests and treats for purely humanitarian reasons. This is what people are taught today, every day. Thus sanctifying the psychiatrist's role and persona, quotes, again I'm quoting Heinroth, he influences a patient by virtue of his, if one may be permitted to say, holy presence, by the sheer strength of his being, his grace, glance, and goodwill.